I yield an additional minute to the gentleman.
Recognized for one additional minute.
Work on my math problem during the minute, see if you can get the answer. So, you know, this, I was thinking of bringing a map of all the leasable land, but it would have been, difficult to produce. But you can get it in your imagination. So let's deal with the real problems before us. If we're going to produce energy on federal lands, make sure there's no real conflict. Let's keep the multiple use concept. I think most members of the public support that, not give oil and gas a predominant use. Let's also keep in mind that we have to look at alternative energy development on federal lands so that we can deal with climate change, which some of us believe in. But this warmed over, leftover turkey proposal will pass the House, of course. But that'll be the last that anyone hears of it. Happy Thanksgiving.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to another member of the Resources Committee, gentlelady from Wyoming, Mrs. Lummis.
Gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to put a couple things straight that have been said. We're not talking about all federal lands in this bill. We're not talking about National Park Service lands. National parks and national monuments are excluded from this bill. We're not talking about wilderness. We're not talking about lands that has been recommended for wilderness status. Those are managed as de facto wilderness. We're not talking about wildlife refuges. We're not talking about Department of Defense lands. We're not talking about Bureau Reclamation lands. We're only talking about Bureau of Land Management lands that are managed for multiple use now. We're also talking about a nation that desperately needs jobs. Mr. Speaker, I was in a country in the Arab world last weekend. They have 6.5% employment in the private sector. Everyone else is either unemployed or works for the government. Their neighbors prop up their economies to keep their problems from spilling over the borders into their countries. For a country that has been clamoring for jobs, to smack down this bill as being irrelevant indicates to me that Congress has lost its way, that it doesn't understand that what the American people is want to work. They want earned success. They want self-respect. They want jobs. H.R. 1965 would streamline the leasing and permitting process to put our public land resources back to work for the people who own them, the American people, particularly those who live near these resources and know the importance of a quality environment. I represent the whole state of Wyoming. I've lived there my entire life. Nobody cares more about the environment of Wyoming than I do. Nobody. This is also good fiscal policy. In what?
Lady is recognized for 30 additional seconds.
Wyoming's payments to the U.S. Treasury for oil, gas, and coal royalties nearly pays for the entire BLM budget. And I would point out that, contrary to what the gentleman said about the increase in production on federal land, between 2009 and between the year 2000 and 2007 in Wyoming, number of new leases issued was 873 on average. During the Obama administration, it's 599. In my book, that's a decline of 31%. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank Mr. Hastings and Lamborn for making this bill possible. I urge you to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. Gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I would like to reserve my time and ask the gentleman how many speakers he has yet.
Mr. Chairman, I have one more speaker, and then I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
All right, Mr. Chairman, I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, a gentleman from a state that certainly knows what oil production is about, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. For the first time in nearly 20 years, the United States is producing more crude oil than it imports. U.S. oil output is soaring due to the fracking boom in North Dakota and, yes, in Texas and some other areas. That's the reason. Energy Information Administration said this week that oil production by barrels is up 11% from last year and 63% over the last 5 years. If this trend continues with the expanded use of renewables and, of course, the completion of the Keystone Pipeline, it's entirely possible we could see a total energy independence in this country in the next 10 years. And imagine what our foreign policy could be if we were energy independent. We could make Middle Eastern oil and turmoil in politics irrelevant. However, all this progress has been done despite the current administration. And how ironic it is, the administration takes credit for all the oil production boom when it does everything it can to stonewall this boom. The oil and natural gas production on federal lands is down 40% compared to 10 years ago. Most of the new drilling is on private and state land, not federal land. Under this administration, 2010 had the lowest number of offshore leases since 1984. Imagine what we could do if we could speed up the permitting process on federal land. To address this, H.R. 1965 expands onshore oil and natural gas production on federal lands and streamlines the leasing and permitting process, among many other common-sense provisions to help to get the government out of the way of progress. And I'll yield back.
Gentleman from Texas yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I would like to address the talking points that have been parroted without thinking by speaker after speaker from the other side. The fact is, oil production on onshore public lands, the subject of this legislation, is up by 35%. It's not down, it's not flat, it is up. It's up even more than oil production in the country overall. So what is the problem here? As for employment, it's worth pointing out that oil and natural gas industry employment has increased. Now, clearly there was a fall-off with the recession, or let's call it a depression. But in the last half-dozen years, industry employment has increased by more than 162,000, a 40% increase. Oil and gas industry jobs decreased in 2009 as a result of the recession, but now they're increasing the jobs are increasing at a rate faster even than before then. Our federal lands, and I have to emphasize that in connection with this, because this legislation says that oil and gas would take precedence over all other uses of federal lands. Federal lands don't exist solely for the purpose of oil and gas extraction. And as I said before, there is one thing that the Republicans seem to be able to agree on, that we should give away whatever we can to the oil companies. That's why we're doing this legislation, because they don't have any other legislation that they agree on well enough to bring it to the floor. But multiple uses of our federal lands, aside from oil and gas production, are important to Americans. And as for jobs, the government shutdown that the folks who are proposing this legislation voted for and supported caused the closure of over 400 units of our National Park Service and cost local economies hundreds of millions of dollars and caused delays in the approval of pending permits, by the way. It's also worth pointing out that this week the Interior Department announced that because of revenues from oil and gas extraction, the Department of the Interior was able to disperse $14.2 billion, a 17% increase over the previous year, to state and local and tribal accounts. This money goes for Land and Water Conservation Fund and Reclamation Fund, Historic Preservation, and so forth. So this is a bill to address a problem that doesn't exist, to do it in a way that does not improve the, does not address the interests of the people at large. It is a giveaway to the oil and gas industry, and I urge my colleagues to vote this down. I yield back my time.
Gentleman from New Jersey yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have?
Gentleman from Washington has 5 1/4 minutes remaining.
I yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, just let me kind of talk about what this bill is about. This bill is about attempting to open federal lands to energy production. Now, it's not all the talk has been on oil and gas. That's very important. But it is also for renewable by doing what? By saying that when the process of using federal lands for energy production, those lands that have the potential for the most production should be the first lease. What a remarkable idea. Go where the potential energy is, and that's what this bill does. But let me respond to my good friend from New Jersey who talked about how much we are producing in this country and so forth. I would suggest that he left out a few important points. First of all, it takes some length of time in order to get an active lease into production. And the gentleman didn't talk about that. Why? Because it generally takes 4 to 6 years and sometimes 8 to 10 years. But in the last administration, Bush II administration, they are very active in letting leases. And as a result of that, at the time that this administration took over, there were a number of active leases that were ready to produce. That's why the production was high in the early part of this administration. But since then, just look at that this way. Again, we're talking about federal lands that are being leased for production. When the President took office, roughly 1.9 million acres were leased for energy production. That was in 2009. In 2012, that figure dropped to 1.75 million acres that were open for production. That's obviously a reduction. But another way to look at it is the application permits to drill, which is really where I guess it meets the road, so to speak. In 2001, there were little over 2,000 permits that were issued. In 2012, there were a little over 1,700 permits issued. That's a 15% drop. Well, if you drop the permits, you're obviously going to have less production. So I think that needed to be pointed out to kind of set the record straight. And as to my good friend who's not on the floor now, Mr. Dingell, I want to talk about the National Petroleum Alaska Reserve one more time. 90 years ago, that was set aside as a national reserve. All the years that Democrats controlled Congress from mid-50s all the way to the 90s, nothing was ever done to change that policy until this administration decided without any direction from Congress to set aside 1/2 of that. Why is that important? I mentioned in my opening remarks that the Trans-Alaska Pipeline is a very important part of our pipeline system. And there's no question that there's a movement in this country to try to dry up that pipeline by slow-walking oil exploration in Alaska, whether you're talking about offshore or onshore. The NPR was designed to be a petroleum reserve. Why should we not build an infrastructure to utilize that? And it's been said, well, there's not that much oil there. Well, that'll come out when the leases are offered. Those that want to, take advantage of this and think that there's some production there, they'll make the leases. The market will dictate that. But to unilaterally close it off doesn't make any sense. This bill corrects that. It makes NPRA what it was supposed to be historically since 1923. So those are just a couple of issues, Mr. Chairman, I wanted to touch on. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I will yield back my time.
The gentleman from Washington yields back the balance of his time. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. In lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Natural Resources printed in the bill, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 113-26 is adopted. The bill, as amended, shall be considered as the original bill for the purpose of further amendment under the 5-minute rule and shall be considered as read. No further amendment to the bill as amended shall be in order except those printed in Part A of House Report 113-271. Each such further amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 1, printed in Part A of House Report 113-271. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have amendment made in order under the rule.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment numbered 1, printed in Part A of House Report number 113-271, offered by Mr. Hastings of Washington.
Pursuant to House Resolution 419, the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Hastings, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment makes adjustments in the bill to the amount of funds authorized to be made available to BLM field offices for energy permitting. This change is made to ensure the bill meets its goal of reducing the deficit, not increasing spending. According to information from the Congressional Budget Office, after adoption of this amendment, the underlying bill would reduce the deficit by $26 million while generating more American energy and new jobs for American workers. This amendment sets the funding directed to wind and solar energy permitting in local BLM field offices at $5 million each fiscal year. Currently, under existing law, no funds get sent to those doing the work to permit these renewable projects. After the amendment, the amount to help foster renewable energy on federal lands is less than currently in the bill, but is far more than the $0 that are allocated today. A vote for this amendment is a vote for an all-of-the-above approach to American energy. It's a vote for more American-made energy, and it's a vote to support renewable energy that uses its own funds and non-taxpayer subsidies. And, Mr. Chairman, it is a vote to reduce the deficit, and I reserve my time.
Gentleman from Washington reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes.
I wanted to point out a curious but revealing point about this amendment. In order to get the bill to score properly to fit with the policy of the Republican conference, it was necessary to cut $5 million out of the authorization in the bill. So where did they go? To cut $5 million out of renewable energy and let the tens of millions of dollars of authorized funds for the oil and gas to sit untouched. But I'd really like to address something else that the gentleman said that has to do with the whole reason we're here today on this bill, instead of doing that important work that Mr. Hoyer spoke of earlier. The gentleman talked about how we have to increase the supply of oil so that we can drive down prices at the pump, and talked about how the policies of Mr. Bush, President Bush, were responsible for the increases, the undeniable increases in onshore oil production. And they say that gas was as much as $4 a gallon in 2008. You know whose fault that was? And then in 2009, it was $2 a gallon. Did the supply in the United States change that much in 1 year? No, this shows quite clearly that it's not because of the amount of drilling on public lands. That has nothing to do, or next to nothing, a scant effect on price at the pump. It's amazing, Mr. Speaker, when confronted with something uncomfortable, the Republicans always have a convenient excuse. Gas prices were $4 a gallon in 2008. Oh, that's because Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House. Gas prices plummet later that year to half that amount. Well, that's because President Bush said we'd need to drill more. Then gas prices shoot up after John Boehner becomes Speaker of the House, but that's because President Obama is in office. And now oil production on federal lands skyrocket under President Obama. It's a boom, but that's really because of President Bush. So if gas prices go down further this year, maybe that's because of, I don't know, was it Eisenhower or Reagan? Give me a break. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I urge adoption of the amendment, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Washington yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Washington. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 2, printed in Part A of House Resolution 113-271. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in Part A of House Report number 113-271, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 419, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas.
Let me thank the Speaker, the Chairman, and let me thank Mr. Holt, Mr. Hastings, and the Rules Committee for admitting this amendment. We could all engage in discussions about our commitment to a national energy policy. I would venture to say that we not find one member of this body that was not committed to the idea of individuals being able to have low costs at the pump and to be able to have heat in the winter, in the severe winters, and air conditioning for those of us in the heat of the summer in places like Texas and elsewhere. We are committed to doing so. I said this earlier this morning on the rules. Let me thank the Rules Committee for this rule that has been admitted on my behalf, but let me also say that we will do better if we come across the aisle and talk about the issues. Again, sustainable environment, sustainable energy policy, creation of jobs, and addressing the needs of low-income families. That is the American way. The American way is also the ability to petition your government in the system of laws that we have. And my amendment is simple. It indicates that the underlying bill should not be construed to abridge the right of the people to petition for the redress of grievances in violation of the first article of the amendment to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. It is important to note that there is a $5,000 fee for anyone that wants to protest the particular structure in this bill upon agreed parties to challenge the award by the agency of a lease, right-of-way, permit to drill on public lands. This $5,000 fee is supposed to be given comfort, or you give comfort, because on the larger entities, the businesses, it's a $6,500 fee. But for many parties, that may adversely affect the individuals, homeowners, small businesses, nonprofits, and community organizations. A filing or documentation fee of this amount, in many cases, is prohibitive and will discourage many injured parties from taking the action necessary to vindicate their rights. My amendment seeks to avoid this undesirable result by making it plain that it is not the intent of Congress to discourage parties from seeking relief where necessary or to deny access to justice to any party with a legitimate claim. And so I ask my colleagues to support this amendment. I reserve my time.
Gentlewoman from Texas reserves the balance of her time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman from Washington is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I yield myself as much time as I may.
The gentleman
consider.
is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to oppose this amendment. To be clear, nothing in this act prohibits individuals from asserting their right to petition the government. In fact, it would be ridiculous for us to try to write a statute that would negate the First Amendment. So nothing in this bill does that at all. But let me talk about the process here. The BLM undertakes multiple layers of rulemaking and environmental review when going through their federal actions. Nearly every layer of this process allows for the opportunity for public comments, involvements, and questions regarding BLM's actions. Nothing, Mr. Chairman, in this legislation impacts an individual's right to comment, petition, and object to actions of BLM under this bill. Nothing, by the way, in this legislation stops individuals from filing lawsuits. That's important in this debate on this amendment. But H.R. 1965 simply implements a cost recovery fee for the formal process of filing protests of oil and gas leasing. These formal protests require a direct BLM response using staff time, energy, and resources to address what is simply often a delaying tactic. This paperwork recovery fee will ensure that BLM has the resources necessary to address the protest, but has the necessary resources to carry out the functions of the Bureau of Land Management, which is for multiple purpose use in this country. So it's for these reasons, Mr. Chairman, well, I oppose this amendment because it does not add anything to what people already have a constitutional right to do, and I reserve my time.
Gentleman from Washington reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I take issue with my good friend from Washington State. This bill has a $5,000 documentation fee on the stage of protest and petition. Obviously, our good friends on the industry side don't even pay anything to nominate land. But it is a $5,000 barrier. My friend refers to the administration process, the administrative. I am a lawyer. It is under the APA code. That is different from being able to go to a higher level and to be able to comment under the Federal Register and write that I don't like this, and then you're ruled against anyhow. Then your next level of protest is to be able to protest at the level that requires you to pay $5,000, not even $1,000. We're scoring this, and we're doing it on the backs of citizens. My amendment does make sense, because what it says is that we are committed as a Congress not to block people from being able to have an equal opportunity to protest. They may not prevail, Mr. Chairman, but an equal opportunity. And my amendment, I believe it would be senseless for Republicans and Democrats not to go on record to say that we support the opportunity for protest and petition. I am pro-energy independence, pro-jobs, pro-growing the economy, pro-fairness, pro-the sustainable environment, and I believe that there are opportunities for us to come together. We haven't listened to each other. The gentleman, Mr. Holt, has made some very important statements. I'm making a statement about the idea I believe it is egregious to have a $5,000 fee on individuals, nonprofits, farmers, ranchers, neighbors, etc. And I will say to you, if you want to understand what it means, in my town there is a group going to court to fight against a high-rise. That high-rise, Mr. Chairman, they went through every process. The Planning Commission, the City Council rejected, but they are going into a lawsuit. They happen to be a little bit more prosperous. Farmers, ranchers, and others having to pay $5,000, neighbors having to pay $5,000, I simply think that is excessive. And I ask my colleagues, since the amendment that I had to eliminate the $5,000, I welcome a compromise of $1,000. But I offer this simple statement that what we do today shall not be construed to abridge the right of the people to petition for the redress of grievances in violation of the first article of the amendment, and it protects the Fifth Amendment as well, which is due process, your right to protect your property. And frankly, I believe that is extremely important, because there are entities that are near federal lands. And so I would ask my colleagues, with the generosity of spirit, I'd ask them to support the Jackson-Lee Amendment.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
How much time?
Gentleman from Washington has 3 minutes remaining.
I yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Well, first of all, Mr. Chairman, this has this bill has nothing to do with high-rises, so we should set that apart. And I know the gentlelady was using that as an example. But I have to say this in a larger sense. And that is that in the time that I've had the privilege to chair this committee, we have seen over and over and over what I would call frivolous action by people trying to, with lawsuits trying to slow down the process. Gentlelady used her example of high-rises in Houston. I'll use another example that I think this House needs to address, and that's the issue of Endangered Species Act and how it affects development in other parts of the country. But setting that aside for now, this bill simply says that going through the process, there should be something up front if you're serious about your issue. Nothing more than that. This is a modest way to say that if people are serious about the action that they are trying to take, then there ought to be, nothing more than some skin in the game. And that's what this bill does. This amendment would take that out. That is why I oppose the amendment, and I urge my colleagues to vote no, and I yield back my time.
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Chairman, with that I ask for recorded vote, the yeas and nays.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in Part A of House Report 113-271. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 3, printed in Part A of House Report number 113-271, offered by Mr. Lowenthal of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 419, the gentleman from California, Mr. Lowenthal, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
The amendment I offer today maintains the Interior Department's ability to review oil and gas activities for significant impacts on public health and safety, among other extraordinary circumstances. While predictable, it is unfortunate that the majority again and again is willing to throw out basic health and safety protections in order to speed up oil and gas extractions for industry. Whether it is in this oil and gas industry bill today, last week's mining industry bill, or tomorrow's natural gas industry bill, the majority's common theme is getting rid of transparency and protections for public health and safety and threatening our environment in the name of increased profits for industry. Well, this is not okay with me. This is not why I came to Washington. The oil and gas industry is the most profitable in the world, and the rates of domestic extraction have increased under the Obama administration. ExxonMobil reported profits of over $44 billion in net income in 2012. Net income, not profits, in 2012. I know it, Wall Street knows it, and their balance sheets prove it. These companies are doing fine. So why are we stripping our oversight agencies and the ability of the public to ensure that extraction is done responsibly and not at the expense of the welfare of this and future generations? I think it is short-sighted, I think it is irresponsible, and I think it is wrong. H.R. 1965, as is currently written, would prevent, and I say that again, would prevent the Interior Department from reviewing oil and gas activities that would otherwise qualify for skipping the National Environmental Policy Act for extraordinary circumstances. Section 390 of the Energy and Policy Act of 2005 allows certain qualifying oil and gas activities to potentially skip a full NEPA process through a categorical exclusion. Title 43 of Section 46.205 of the Code of Federal Regulations requires that the Interior Department to test for extraordinary circumstances in which a normally excluded action may have a significant environmental effect and require additional analyses and action. Title 43 of Section 46.215 of the Code of Federal Regulations goes on to list the types of extraordinary circumstances to be tested before proceeding with a categorical exclusion for the oil and gas activity. Thus, before the Interior Department bypasses NEPA, it currently checks for, this is what it checks for. Are there significant impacts upon public health or safety? Are there violations of federal, state, local, or tribal law? Are there limits to access and ceremonial use of Indian sacred sites? And is the introduction, continued existence, or spread of noxious weeds or non-invasive species? And it also lists 8 other potential significant problems. This is what the existing law and regulation does. It helps to protect the public and the environment during oil and gas activities. Simply speaking, H.R. 1965 eliminates these protections. My amendment would simply preserve them. I urge a yes vote, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves the balance of his time. For purposes, the gentleman from Washington seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, as I said, I rise to oppose this amendment. This amendment would increase regulatory red tape and opportunities for frivolous lawsuits to stop what we're trying to do here, American energy production and job creation. It would achieve the exact opposite of what our nation needs and what the bill provides. H.R. 1965 seeks to streamline and expedite the onshore oil and gas and renewable permitting process, and it does so in a safe and responsible way. This amendment would simply re-inject the same uncertainty and bureaucracy into the permitting process that this legislation seeks to do away with. The Energy Policy Act of 2005, Mr. Chairman, established a broad bipartisan fashion for the use of categorical exclusions for energy projects in specific and limited circumstances. This provision was intended to expedite the permit approvals of certain energy projects on disturbed land, on operations with a small footprint, or in areas that were previously approved in recent years. And again, the Energy Policy Act of 2005 was a bipartisan attempt, and this was provision that I just described was part of the 2005 Act. These pro-energy reforms are designed to allow minor actions that do not significantly affect the environment to move forward without the burdensome and lengthy, full, costly environmental review. This legislation clarifies, to the point the gentleman is making and what the gentleman's amendment addresses, this legislation clarifies the Department's ability to use the categorical exclusion tool to quickly permit energy projects. This amendment, unfortunately, would require the Department of Interior to unreasonably review what we call extraordinary circumstances, end quote, which require additional NEPA reviews, thereby essentially negating any value from expediting a project and inserting more uncertainty into an already uncertain energy permitting process. The intent of this legislation is to streamline and simplify projects that are held up, often for years in bureaucratic red tape and regulatory uncertainty. This amendment backtracks from the goal by injecting more bureaucracy and regulatory hurdles into the process. So, Mr. Chairman, I don't think this amendment adds anything to what we are trying to accomplish. In fact, I think it goes the other way, and it goes in the other way in such a way that negates what the Energy Act of 2005 in a bipartisan manner said. So I urge a rejection of the amendment, and I reserve my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from California is recognized.
And how much time do I have?
The gentleman from California has 1.5 minutes remaining.
Thank you. Remember what the gentleman from Washington is saying, that if we remove the extraordinary circumstances part of seeing whether, in fact, we grant a categorical exemption. What he is wanting, what my amendment does by saying no, that the public must have an opportunity, if we're going to grant an exemption, which we think is fine, but what is wrong with finding out whether there's going to be a significant impact on health and safety? What is wrong with finding out if there's going to be a violation of state, federal, local, or tribal law? What is wrong with understanding what are the limits to access to ceremonial use of sacred sites? He says that this imposes, by asking these questions before we give an exemption, that this imposes regulatory red tape. That's exactly the opposite of what the nation needs. It's more bureaucracy. It is just the opposite. This protects the nation. This allows us to understand when we give a categorical exemption that we are protecting the public health of the nation. I urge and I vote on my amendment.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
The gentleman yielded back his time?
Yes, I do.
I yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Notwithstanding what my good friend from California said, I just want to make this point, which ironically was not brought out at all in the gentleman's argument, and that is the issue of categorical exclusion. Now, that's been in place on energy projects now for 8 years. If there is something wrong with that, or there's an example of where it's been abused, then maybe the gentleman has a case. But the gentleman didn't speak at all, not at all, to the point that that provision in the 2005 Energy Act has been abused. That alone should be enough to reject this amendment. But in any case, I do not believe that his amendment adds to what we're trying to do to streamline the process of energy creation and creating American energy jobs. So I urge rejection of this amendment, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 4, printed in Part A of House Report 113-271. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
Chairman, I have an amendment today.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in Part A of House Report number 113-271, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 419, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas.
I yield myself 3 minutes.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the chair for yielding, and again thank the managers, Mr. Holt, Mr. Hastings, and I again make the same comment about what I've heard on this floor from members on both sides of the aisle, that they are pro-energy policy, pro-environment, pro-jobs, pro-sustainable environment. They simply want an opportunity to work on legislation to activate or to ensure that that occurs. There is a prohibition contained in Section 1147 of this legislation with respect to the recovery of attorney's fees and costs by a prevailing party pursuant to the Equal Access of Justice Act. My amendment removes the prohibition, a prohibition that has been established law for a very long time. This amendment is needed to level the playing field and conform the bill to current law and practice. And I think that if we listen to each other, it'll be a simple answer of yes. If we ask any citizen, should they have a right to sue, and if they prevail under the Equal Justice Act, that they are able to get attorney's fees. I think the answer, when clear heads would respond, not whether or not it's an energy bill or not, or who the defendant is, they would say, why shouldn't this bill be subjected to the law that exists? the Equal Justice Act allows individuals, small businesses, and nonprofits to recover attorney's fees from the federal government. This act is used to vindicate a variety of federal rights, including access to Veterans Affairs, Social Security, and and to secure statutory environmental protections. And so, therefore, to eliminate that is, again, to cut into the very Bill of Rights of your right to petition, to the right to counsel, all of that, because it indicates that you have a right to prevail in attorney's fees. It is a simple process that does not undermine, if you will, the question of the energy policy in the United States. If we look at the first poster, we will acknowledge the fact that, interestingly enough, the average amount of money under these cases was $1.8 million annually over the last 8 years. The EPA only paid out $280,000 annually over the last 5 years. I'd venture to say, with the average payment of $100,000, this is not busting the bank. This is allowing citizens who prevail to be able to have attorney's fees, and I clearly believe that the legislation that we have warrants a fix, a fair fix, to be able to ensure that anyone that has a disagreement post the administrative process and goes into court can, in fact, utilize. This is one that shows that, in fact, local environmental groups and national environmental groups are no more than others, and the largest amount goes to various state governments, individuals, various unions and workers that got minimal amount or may not have even prevailed. And so I think it is important to recognize that this is not one that is going to destroy this bill. It's going to enhance the bill. With that, I reserve my time.
Time has expired. Gentlewoman from Texas reserves the balance of her time. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I say, I rise to oppose this amendment. The Equal Access to Justice Act, or the EAGA, was created, rightfully so, to level the playing field between citizens seeking to do the right thing and a well-funded federal government. Unfortunately, wealthy activist groups have been able to distort the intended purpose of the EAGA by exploiting the program as a cash register to file thousands of lawsuits, many based on frivolous technicalities. Further, federal payments to lawyers fighting lawsuits come out of each agency's budgets, which of course hinders the agency's ability to do their jobs, and it forces tighter budgets on the agencies working on behalf of Americans. Every year, numerous energy projects are held up by burdensome legal challenges by activist groups whose aim is to hold up or simply stop energy production in this country. Under the guise of responsible development, these groups file lawsuit after lawsuit that force the government to use federal resources and millions of dollars in taxpayer funds to litigate these lengthy and burdensome lawsuits. These well-funded activist groups have the resources to hire, in some cases, multiple lawyers to sue the federal government. These unnecessary delays in energy projects result in a domino effect of delays in economic development, of delays, obviously, in job creation, of delays in income generation for local, state, and indeed the federal government, and delays in making the United States becoming energy independent. Further, many small communities depend on a robust energy sector to provide jobs for its residents and generate income for their local schools and for their communities. These well-funded activist organizations should not be rewarded, Mr. Chairman, with taxpayer dollars for delaying American job creation and generation of funds for our local communities. So I urge my colleagues to vote no on the amendment, and with that I reserve my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves the balance of his time. The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
I thank the chairman very much. Let me be very clear that the awards under the EAJA are not available for any and every case, only when the plaintiff prevails. Is that not fair? When an individual, a nonprofit, who has sought to even the playing field, who wants to make sure that we have a strong energy policy, but they're praying that you listen to them as to how it is destroying their property, their house, their quality of life. They have a right to petition. And so I want to correct the gentleman's interpretation. And I heard on the floor of the House that he mentioned the word frivolous. As a lawyer and one that adheres to the Constitution, I'd like to not think that if you are concerned about an issue that you cannot get into the court of justice and that you cannot make your case. You may not win, but I want to surprise him with the fact that the large number of cases that went under this act and sued the EPA were trade associations, 622, private companies, 556. There are a variety of others, not collectively together. State, territories, and municipalities, 297. Should they not recover if they prevail? Should environmental groups not recover if they prevail? Only at 388? Should individuals at 185 cases not prevail if they win? Should workers' groups and universities and tribes not prevail if they should win? So I think that we are wrong-headed if we simply do not adhere to the existing law, not use the terminology frivolous, but applaud Americans who are willing to stand up for their rights. My example was correct. It was an analogy. These homeowners are fighting big business, but what they decided to do is after they were ruled against by every administrative local body, they've gone into the courthouse. They happen to be more prosperous than someone else, but why would you fault an individual who's using their meager pennies with an attorney to try and prevail on something that they believe will harm them? So my amendment is very simple. It just indicates if you prevail, you should not be denied the attorney's fees that anyone else would, and to, if you will, debunk and rebut the proposition that only those groups that we might not enjoy their position, trade associations, private big companies, I ask my colleague to support the Jackson-Lee Amendment for fairness and justice in America. I yield back.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentleman from Washington is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I would just simply say that what this bill, and the bill tomorrow for that matter, but what this bill does is designed to create an atmosphere for more American energy production, which I think is badly needed in our economy, because we know that a growing economy by any measure has to have a predictable energy source. That has been lacking on our federal land. That is what the underlying bill does. And what we have seen and what we have observed in our committee is the fact that the courtroom is used to slow down so many projects on federal land. This provision in the current bill simply, I think, clarifies and rectifies that we can have some certainty in the law. And that, I think, is the important part of creating American energy. And with that, I don't think that this amendment adds anything to that. I urge rejection of the amendment. With that, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I would like a recorded vote, the yeas and nays.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 5, printed in Part A of House Report 113-271. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Hawaii seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment numbered 5, printed in Part A of House Report number 113-271, offered by Ms. Hanabusa of Hawaii.
Pursuant to House Resolution 419, the gentlewoman from Hawaii, Ms. Hanabusa, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Hawaii.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment is nearly identical to one I proposed last Congress to a similar natural resources bill numbered H.R. 4480, which is agreed to by a voice vote. This amendment simply adds to Title II
the Planning for America Energy Act of 2013, a subsection H, which essentially mirrors the language found in a prior subsection addressing Native American tribal lands. This particular amendment requires the inclusion of Hawaiian Homes Commission Act lands. As you know, Hawaii is a unique situation in that in 1920, this Congress created the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act, and there is a special body of approximately 203,000 acres of land in Hawaii, which is under the control of Congress. Congress approves whether or not things can be amended in the Act. Even upon statehood, that right was retained by Congress. This amendment seeks to have those Hawaiian homelands that the state agency or department responsible for the administration of these lands have selected to be used for the development of geothermal, solar, wind, and other renewable energy sources included in the quadrennial federal onshore energy production strategy. It has no other implications other than the fact that these lands could be used for renewable energy development, and that these lands have somehow become forgotten but do necessarily fall under federal jurisdiction. With that, Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman.
Yes.
Gentlelady, yield to me?
Yes.
I have no problem with your amendment. As you rightfully said in the last Congress, this was accepted by a voice vote. I think it adds more lands to energy production, and as the gentlelady knows, I'm in favor of that, so we accept the gentlelady's amendment, and I yield back to her.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlewoman from Hawaii yields back the balance of her time.
Yes, and I yield back the balance
of my time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Hawaii. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 6, printed in Part A of House Report 113-271. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 6, printed in Part A of House Report number 113-271, offered by Mr. Marino of Pennsylvania.
Pursuant to House Resolution 419, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Marino, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Study after study proved that pipelines are the safest, most environmentally friendly, and most efficient method for transporting oil and natural gas. A company in my district tried to expand a current pipeline or build a new pipeline through a recreation area, but were unable to do so because of bureaucratic red tape and mess. Instead of expanding a pipeline that was in the ground before the recreation area was created, the company had to loop the pipeline around the recreation area in order to provide natural gas to residents in New Jersey. This forced the company to add 7 additional miles of pipeline, even though it would be more environmentally friendly to build a pipeline through the park. Yet the level of bureaucratic red tape in trying to construct oil and gas pipelines through federal lands is nothing short of ludicrous. My amendment wouldn't resolve the problem we experience in my district. However, this amendment takes a small step in addressing the difficulties in constructing pipelines by requiring the Secretary of Interior to include a plan for addressing new demands from transmission lines and pipelines for distribution of oil and gas across federal lands to ensure that energy produced can be distributed to areas of need. Common sense tells us that without the necessary pipeline infrastructure to transport the energy, it will be much more difficult to meet America's future oil and gas demands. I yield back.
Gentleman yield.
Yes, I yield.
I want to thank the gentleman for bringing this amendment to the floor. I think it adds a great deal to what we're trying to do with energy development in this country, and I am prepared to accept the amendment, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. I yield back to him. Reserve your time.
I reserve my time.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves the balance of his time. Members seek time in opposition to the amendment. From Pennsylvania is recognized. The gentleman from Pennsylvania yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment number 7, printed in Part A of House Report 113-271. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, 11326.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 7, printed in Part A of House Report number 113-271, offered by Mr. Polis of Colorado.
Pursuant to House Resolution 419, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Polis, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I offered my amendment along with Representative Huffman from California. It's a very simple amendment. It would require the National Academy of Sciences to study and report to Congress about the impact of flooding on oil and gas facilities and resulting instances of leakages and spills from tanks, wells, and pipelines. Sadly, this is an issue that hits very close to home in my district in Colorado. We recently suffered from the Great Flood of 2013. Many counties in my district were declared federal disaster areas. Many of those counties are also home to significant extraction operations. Floods can happen anywhere, and this one occurred well outside of the floodplain. It's important to understand how to minimize damage to oil and gas infrastructure in the event of a flood. Constituents in my district in Colorado are rebuilding. We're working hard, and we wish, frankly, that we had the kind of information that this study would produce years before the flood so that we could have better prepared with regard to our oil and gas infrastructure and the safeguards around it. We do know a few things about the impact of the flood so far with regard to oil and gas facilities in northern and northeastern Colorado. Over 43,000 gallons of oil and 26,000 gallons of produced water is spilled from the tanks, wells, and pipelines in the flood water. If we have a lot to learn from this experience, I hope that future areas that are impacted by flooding as well as ours, which we never know whether the next flood is decades or years or centuries away, will be able to avoid these kinds of spills in our communities. And on September 25th, I did join Representative Fazio sending a letter to Chairman Hastings requesting a hearing to understand the consequences resulting from the flood. I continue to hope that the gentleman from Alaska will be open to scheduling that hearing with regard to the impact of flooding or perhaps more generally disasters and how we can better safeguard our oil and gas infrastructure in this country. The floods in Colorado did shed a light on the need to better understand how we can safeguard our oil and gas infrastructure from disasters. Generally, in our case, a terrible flood that had 7 confirmed fatalities and hundreds of millions of dollars of property damage. We would all benefit from learning more about how disasters like the Colorado flood can impact community, states, and indeed the federal government. Local elected officials, first responders, experts in oil and gas technology and innovation, and the Academy of Sciences can help enhance our understanding of how to prevent damage to oil and gas infrastructure and avert spills and leaks in other communities. We don't want our communities to have to learn the hard way, as ours has done. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Colorado reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
I rise to claim time in opposition.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman from Washington is